everybody. I'm Robin Covington from the Rhode Island Coalition for Elder Justice. And today, myself, Cheryl Patnaude, and Christopher Liu will be recording a module for HopeHealth Hospice. We're going to be talking about elder abuse in end of life in hospice settings.
Elder abuse is a silent epidemic. Research studies conducted before the pandemic estimated that about 1 in 10 older adults experiences some form of elder mistreatment. However, more recent studies have suggested that this number might be as high as 1 in 5. What is elder abuse? There are 5 components of elder abuse. The first component involves who is being abused. Individuals aged 60 and older per Rhode Island general law may become victims of elder abuse. Elder abuse can impact people of all genders. What type of abuse may occur? Abuse can take the form of physical, sexual, psychological abuse, financial exploitation, or neglect. Who is committing the abuse? Abuse can be committed by a family member, an adult child, a caretaker, or a scammer. One commonality that many abusers share is that they are someone who is trusted by the victim. Where is the abuse occurring? The abuse can occur in any setting, including the home, in an assisted living or nursing home setting, or others. Context. Why is the abuse occurring? Is it because of age, disability, legal status, or the expectation of trust? Types of elder abuse and mistreatment. There are several types of elder abuse and mistreatment that providers are required by law to report. These include physical abuse, which involves use of force causing pain or injury, inappropriate use of medications, for example, use of medications to incapacitate or over-medicate the older adults, or use of physical restraints. Sexual abuse involves non-consensual sexual activity, or engaging in sexual activity with an older adult who can no longer provide consent, for example, an older adult with a dementing condition or who is unconscious. Psychological abuse involves mistreatment that affects emotional or mental health, intimidation, threats, harassment, humiliation, isolation, or belittlement. Financial exploitation involves misuse of money, property, or resources, stealing social security checks, pension, etc., using bank information without consent, or financial scams. Neglect by a caregiver involves deprivation of food, clothing, shelter, medicine, or good personal hygiene. Neglect by a caregiver can be intentional, aka malicious, or unintentional due to lack of resources. Self-neglect involves a vulnerable adult living in a way that puts his or her health, safety, or well-being at risk. It's important to note that an older victim is likely to experience co-occurrence or multiple forms of abuse at the same time.
Some signs of physical abuse. It's important to remember that not all signs are visible. So the first is bruises, black eyes, welts, lacerations, or rope marks, perhaps from being restrained. We often see bone fractures, broken bones, skull fractures, open wounds, cuts, punctures, untreated injuries in various stages of healing. And that also points to medical neglect. We see sprains, dislocations, or internal injuries and bleeding, broken eyeglasses, frames, physical signs of being subjected to punishment or signs of being restrained, laboratory findings of medication overdose or underutilization of prescribed drugs, an older adult's sudden change in behavior, the caregiver's refusal to allow visitors to see or speak to an older adult alone, and an older adult's report of being hit, slapped, kicked, or mistreated. And it's important to remember that by far, most elder victims of abuse do not disclose the abuse for fear of being put in a nursing home, which is often what the perpetrator will threaten them with, or fear of retaliation, or fear that their loved one will be arrested and go to jail. So it's important to look at whether or not what the adult victim is saying really matches the injuries. Additional signs of financial exploitation, which occurs very, very frequently, include sudden changes in bank accounts or banking practices, including an unexplained withdrawal of large sums of money by a person accompanying the adult. And this can be a caregiver, it can also be a relative. Oftentimes, victims will give their debit card, for example, to a caregiver to go to pick up their prescriptions, and slowly the caregiver will purchase something that the victim has not approved of. And once the victim does not notice that because they don't have access to their banking, then oftentimes what happens is the purchases grow in terms of expense. The also the inclusion of additional names on an older adult's bank signature card, unauthorized withdrawal of the older adult's funds using their ATM card, abrupt changes in a will or other financial documents. And we see this often when we know that the older adult is not doing well medically and perhaps is experiencing the early stages of dying. And we'll see a sudden change in a will or a financial document that the older adult is not aware of in terms of what they're signing. We also see unexplained disappearance of funds or valuable possessions, possession of substandard care or bills left unpaid despite the availability of adequate financial resources. And oftentimes, if the person, the older adult, is in their home, we may see power shutoffs, we may see no heat in the home, and oftentimes perpetrators will forward the elder's mailing address to their address so that the elder has no idea what their financial status is. We also see discovery of forged signatures for financial transactions or titles of the older adult's possessions, sudden appearance of previously uninvolved relatives claiming rights to an older adult's property or possessions. So here we may see an older adult who has lived primarily in isolation, and then when they're nearing death, all of a sudden we see uninvolved relatives show up, not because they're concerned about the elder, but because they're concerned about what they might be entitled to in their perspective. Unexplained sudden transfer of assets to a family member or someone outside the family, the provision of services that are not necessary, an older adult's report of financial exploitation, and unexplained credit charges. And often what we see here is that credit cards are taken out in the name of the older adult, but they're credit cards that clearly the older adult would not be able to use. So for example, if we have an elder who is significantly medically compromised, we may see that in the elder's name, someone has taken out a gym membership. Clearly that doesn't match up, and that's a red flag. Signs of sexual abuse, and it's important to note with sexual abuse that older adults were raised in a culture where they did not talk about anything related to sex or sexual abuse. And so this is the least disclosed type of abuse by older adults. And what we're looking for in terms of signs are bruises around the breasts or genital area, unexplained venereal disease or genital infections, unexplained vaginal or anal bleeding, changes in an older adult's demeanor, such as showing fear or becoming withdrawn when a specific person is around. Often we'll see a startle effect. So when that person walks into the room, the older adult startles. We see evidence of pornographic material being shown to an older adult with diminished capacity. Sometimes blood found on sheets, linens, or an older adult's clothing, and an older adult's report of being sexually assaulted or raped. And what we want to pay attention to is when we're providing medical care and examination of an older adult, we need to remember that many times the bruising or the injuries to the person are between the neck and the groin area, because those are the areas that are covered by clothes and that aren't visible to other persons. Signs of neglect: dehydration, malnutrition, untreated bed sores, and poor personal hygiene. Oftentimes, what the caregiver will say is that the elder adult is not interested in eating, they're not interested in drinking, they don't want to be moved in the bed, they don't want to be changed or showered or bathed. And so that's a red flag as well, because oftentimes it's the caregiver who's neglecting the older adult. We see unattended or untreated health problems, hazardous or unsafe living conditions or arrangements. For example, improper wiring, no heat, no running water. Unsanitary and unclean living conditions. We see dirt, fleas, lice on a person, soiled bedding, fecal urine smell, and inadequate clothing. We also see the desertion of an older adult at a hospital, a nursing facility, or some other institution, or sometimes persons are just dropped off somewhere, for example, at a shopping center or another public location. And what we see in hospitals is oftentimes there is no appropriate or safe discharge plan for the older adult. And so they become warehoused, if you will, in the hospital at a significant cost. We also see an older adult's report of being neglected or abandoned, and lack of food in the refrigerator or cupboards. Signs of emotional abuse: being emotionally upset or agitated, being extremely withdrawn or non-communicative or non-responsive. And oftentimes with this sign or symptom, we see that people who have been very social or very much a part of the crowd and engaged become suddenly withdrawn and suddenly don't respond and aren't socially engaging. Sometimes we see aggressive behavior such as biting, or we see unusual behavior including sucking or rocking, almost like a self-soothing type behavior. We see caregivers who are controlling or isolating an older adult. We have seen cases where an older adult's family member will obtain a no trespass order and post that on the older adult's property. And so then under the law, no one has the ability to go in and check on the victim or the older adult and see what's really going on. We see exhibiting changes in sleeping patterns or eating habits, and those aren't necessarily related to sundowning or sometimes medical issues that create a loss of appetite, or sometimes medications that create a loss of appetite. We see personality changes, such as apologizing excessively, where if I apologize all the time, maybe things will get better, maybe I won't be mistreated. Depression and anxiety, and an older adult's report of being verbally or emotionally mistreated. And verbal and emotional abuse are the most difficult types of abuse to detect and to respond to. So sometimes victims don't disclose abuse. And there are lots of very credible, understandable reasons that they don't disclose. And the reasons victims don't disclose is because of what the caregivers have told the victim. The first being the fear of losing their home or being put into an institution, for example, a nursing home, which is everyone's worst fear as they grow older. Most older adults want to age in place. Their worst nightmare is the thought of having to go into a nursing home. And perpetrators know that, and they use that against the victim. So they will threaten them that if you don't do whatever it is the perpetrator needs, then I'll put you in a nursing home, or I'll fire the caregiving agency, and then you'll see how you do. Fear of retaliation. If you do this, then I'm going to do that. We often see cultural values where in certain cultures, for example, and there are still patriarchal family settings where the older male basically controls everything, not because of control issues, but perhaps because that's the way the culture exists. And so the older male may control all of the finances, for example, or all of the important decision making. We see gender identity or sexuality. And oftentimes what we see with LGBTQIA plus older adult victims is that their fear of being outed, and family members use this against the older adult. And for the older adult, that's their worst fear because, again, they did not grow up in a culture where it was okay to identify and live their gender identity. We see trauma, both acute and historical. So acute trauma being a one-term incident, and historical trauma being trauma that's carried from one generation to the next. For example, slavery. So even though someone may not be a slave in this day and age, they still carry forth that historical trauma from their ancestors. There's the mistrust of government and agencies, and this is also sometimes culturally related, where we'll have an older adult victim from a different culture where in their culture, the police or social service agencies are not seen as helpers. In fact, they're seen as the enemy. So there is that mistrust of government and agencies. There's the fear of being institutionalized that I already spoke to, and the fear of isolation, which happens quite easily because caregivers will often say, I've got this, I'm taking great care of, mom or whomever the elder is, and the other people in the family or friends then feel like, okay, she's being taken care of, so I don't need to step in. And then the isolation occurs. So who can commit elder abuse? Simple answer, anybody. Anyone can commit elder abuse. More than 90% of victims know their abuser. Most often, it's the adult child, followed by caregiver. And caregiver can be a family member or a caregiver from an agency, a paid caregiver. So family members and caregivers are the most common perpetrators of elder abuse. And older adults can also be perpetrators of elder abuse. So, for example, spousal abuse, domestic violence is often prevalent. And what we see is that it's become a learned behavior and it's become accepted. Older adults will say, well, I've been married for 65 years and this is the way it's always been. And what we try to do is educate and encourage people to understand that it doesn't have to be that way.
Reporting elder abuse. Thanks, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
So we're going to be talking now about ways to report elder abuse. According to the Rhode Island general law, we're all mandated reporters. Any person who has a reasonable cause to believe that a person over 60 years of age is being abused, neglected, or exploited, or is self-neglecting shall make an immediate report to the Office of Healthy Aging, and you can do so 24 24/7 online reporting, or there's a phone number that we'll get to in just a minute. There's also the Attorney General's office. So the Rhode Island Attorney General's office accepts reports for any suspicion of elder abuse, particularly financial exploitation. They do have an elder fraud unit and a Medicare fraud unit as well. So that's the Rhode Island Attorney General's office. I also want to make mention that, while there is different numbers and contacts regarding elder abuse, fret not, the appropriate parties will get the report, because they will make sure that, so say you report something to the Attorney General's office, but that it should go to the Office of Healthy Aging. Those parties do speak to each other and will make sure it gets to the appropriate party. So with that said, when reporting abuse, your job as a healthcare staff is not to investigate or to prove that abuse has occurred. Rather, you are operating off of reasonable suspicion of abuse and filing a report to entities who can investigate and intervene. As a mandated reporter, follow your organization's protocol on reporting, but you must report abuse when you see it or suspect it is occurring. And one thing to note is elder abuse can be reported anonymously. And most jobs you would report the elder abuse to the powers that be in terms of your supervisor, but it's also important to take it a step further and report it to the appropriate reporting party such as the Office of Healthy Aging, for instance, if it's somebody over 60. Who you file a report with depends on the setting, as I had mentioned before. So it depends on the setting in which the abuse is taking place and who is committing the abuse. So as mentioned before, Adult Protective Services is through the Office of Healthy Aging. They're the unit within the Office of Healthy Aging that investigate and take any reports of abuse or self-neglect. And it's important to know that they investigate the report, they arrive unannounced, they speak with the victim alone, without the alleged perpetrator present. They ask about the client's safety, comfort, needs, and they refer to community services and case management. Law enforcement is a part of this process as well, if necessary, the Attorney General's office as well. So it's a team effort based on the scenario of what's going on. And the phone number is 462-0555. And again, that's 24/7. And there is an online reporting portal that you can use. The long-term care, so this is called the Alliance for Better Long-Term Care. This is the state ombudsman's office. They hold the contract for the ombudsman. And what that is that's for victims residing in a nursing home setting, assisted living facility, and those receiving licensed home care and or hospice. So with that said, there is the Title 42 United States Code section, and it prohibits an ombudsman representative from disclosing of the identity of the complaint. So again, making sure that the reporter is anonymous. Protecting all parties is really important in this process. What do they do? So what does the ombudsman's office do when you make a report? So similar to APS, at the Office of Healthy Aging, the Ombudsman Office also provides education, ensures victims have timely access to services, and ultimately they advocate for the victim. They can be reached at 401-785-3340. And you can visit their website for more information, but there is not an online reporting tool for that. You can simply call them. So again, the Alliance is for those who are in a setting, a facility setting rather, such as a nursing home or assisted living, hospice, receiving hospice or receiving home care. And then next is the Attorney General's office, which I briefly spoke about a few slides ago. But the Attorney General's office prosecutes all felony criminal cases and misdemeanor appeals, as well as misdemeanor cases brought by the state law enforcement agencies. Additionally, the Attorney General represents all agencies, departments, and commissions in litigation, and initiates legal action where necessary to protect the interests of Rhode Island citizens. They also convene a multidisciplinary elder response team. So it's an MDT team, which is comprised of various social service providers, law enforcement, doctors, financial institutions. It's a complete cohort of different disciplinaries and different disciplines rather, and they come together and they meet about cases, and they try to have, ultimate, resolution to them. So it's important to know that, some of these cases are very complex and it takes a team effort to make sure that the client's needs and rights are protected. You can contact the Attorney General's office at 401-274-4400, and please do visit their website for more information about some of the other things that they do and resources that they may have. Next is the Department of Behavioral Health Care, Developmental Disabilities and Hospitals, affectionately known as BUDA, BHDDH. They call it BUDA as well. And if you suspect a vulnerable person, and what is a vulnerable person? If you suspect somebody that's over 18 that has cognitive impairments, if a vulnerable person is a person over 18 who suffers from physical or mental incapacitation that restricts their ability to perform normal activities of daily living. So these are for people under 60, over 18. And Buddha has a 24-hour line. It's a quality assurance line where you can make anonymous reports at 401-462-2629. And again, the hotline is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Staff responds to reported incidents of abuse, neglect, mistreatment, and financial exploitation. They offer help to individuals needing assistance accessing benefits and services, and they advocate for additional supports if needed. In addition, their quality assurance department works in close collaboration with the Department of the Attorney General to report and resolve findings of violations as required under our general law, and community partners, law enforcement, advocacy groups, and state departments. As always, if there's an emergency, call 911. Above all, call 911. If you're witnessing abuse or violence, or are concerned for an immediate safety of the victim, call 911. All police departments have a law enforcement advocate, which particularly works with sexual assault victims and victims of domestic violence. And then they also have senior advocates who particularly work with the older populations. So you can contact the police department and ask to speak to, the senior police advocate or the law enforcement advocate if it's, sexual assault or domestic violence. And they'll make sure that they put you in touch with that person. Usually, the LEAs we call them LEAs, they can make home visits, they can do safety checks on older persons who may need assistance, and obviously law enforcement can make arrests as needed. Lastly, I wanted to touch base on a couple of resources. The Office of Healthy Aging has a pocket manual. They just released a pocket manual for 2024. It can be found online, or you can request a copy to be mailed to you, whether for you or your organization. You can get these pocket manuals. It has senior services or elder adult services A through Z. It's a great resource for anybody who works with the older adult population. You can find it again at the Office of Healthy Aging's website, or you can call them for a copy to be mailed. There's an elder fraud unit through AARP. So our friends at AARP have a fraud network hotline. And the number is right on your screen. And it is to report a scam or to get help by a trained professional. If you or a loved one has fallen victim to a scam or any type of fraud, call AARP's toll-free number. And it's important to know all of these numbers have been researched, and these are official numbers. National Elder Fraud Hotline is also a great resource if you or someone you know has been a victim of elder fraud. Help is standing by, so you're not alone in this. When folks are experiencing these forms of abuse, it's important to note that they are not alone. They can contact the National Elder Fraud Hotline at 833-FRAUD-11, and there's also an alternate number right on your screen, and that's a Monday through Friday 10 to 6 number. And all of the numbers that we've provided, they do have the ability to provide translation services and ASL services if needed, so that's important to note, so that things don't get lost in translation. Next is the St. Elizabeth's Haven. And without further ado, Cheryl, do you want to tell us about the St. Elizabeth's Haven, given your role within that
Absolutely.
program?
Thank you. So St. Elizabeth Haven for Elder Justice is one program of St. Elizabeth Community, which is a large private nonprofit agency that operates nursing homes, assisted livings, adult day centers, home care agency, etc. But St. Elizabeth Haven for Elder Justice is one program within St. Elizabeth Community. And basically, St. Elizabeth Haven provides shelter services, community advocacy, and legal advocacy to older adults who are victims of abuse, again, age 60 and over. People can call on their own if it is an active case of abuse, neglect, the other areas of abuse that we looked at. Then we call the Office of Healthy Aging to report that. And we have an elder justice advocate, and we are not a 24-hour helpline. We work Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Our number is 401-244-5476. And even if you don't have, a victim in need of shelter or legal advocacy, we're able to provide lots of resources. And Robin did a great job mentioning all the resources available in Rhode Island and on a federal level. But the bottom line is no one should ever feel alone with victims and the work that we're all doing, because we need to do it collectively. So we provide advocacy, shelter, case management, and safety planning for victims in the community. Sometimes a victim will choose to leave and come into shelter. Sometimes they choose to leave shelter and go back to the abuser. It's important to remember that this is not about blaming the victim. It's about holding the perpetrator of the abuse or neglect accountable. So we can never blame victims.
Mm-hmm.
On average, it takes anywhere from 7 to 9 times for a victim to leave a case of abuse or domestic violence before they actually make that final break. And so it's a process. We also have to understand when someone leaves their home for shelter, they're leaving everything behind. They're leaving their belongings, they're leaving their pets, they're leaving their, favorite knickknacks, their favorite blanket, their bed, all of those things that we love about our homes. And it's a lot to ask for a victim to leave and come into shelter, but we do provide that. And so in addition to the services that you see here on the screen, we do serve as a resource for anyone who's needing, just another look-see.
Thank you, Cheryl. Things that are important to note is last year, the St. Elizabeth's Haven assisted around 50 clients, and then 20 of which were put in shelter. So they're doing some great work at the St. Elizabeth's Haven.
Thank you.
Now, we will explore real case studies of elder mistreatment occurring in the hospice setting. Please note that details have been changed to protect patient privacy. The first case study involves Mrs. D. Mrs. D was an 82-year-old woman with ovarian cancer presenting with a small bowel obstruction. Her symptoms are controlled with a nasogastric tube and medications for her nausea and abdominal pain. She was alert and oriented for the first 10 days of her admission, but afterwards became confused and less responsive. While the patient was alert, there were no issues with the patient's husband, who visited frequently. There were no reports of the patient and her husband being intimate although Mrs. D's wishes around intimacy at the end of life were not explored. After Mrs. D became unresponsive and thus unable to provide consent, her husband was found at the bedside with his hands under the blanket, touching the patient's genitals and masturbating. He stopped abruptly after a staff member walked in. The patient's husband was informed that he could not do that, and the door was to remain open at all times. This is an example of sexual abuse of elders. A report was made to the Long-Term Care Ombudsman's office. Per organization protocol, nursing and physician leadership were notified and HR was involved. The second case study involves Mr. S. Mr. S was a 71-year-old man with congestive heart failure and a past medical history of substance use disorder. He was admitted for management of his dyspnea. He had been living at home on hospice in his subsidized housing with his son. He was ambulatory and able to handle all activities of daily living until about 5 weeks prior to admission, when he had required additional assistance with self-care and meals. As his ability to care for himself declined, he became weaker and increasingly unkempt. This is an example of unintentional neglect by a caregiver. His son was trying everything he could to care for his father, but rather lacked necessary supports. The neglect was not occurring due to malintent, but rather due to lack of access to resources. However, opioids were often missing, and it was unclear if Mr. S was using more or if medications were being diverted. If Mr. S was purposefully being over-medicated, that is an example of physical abuse. The Long-Term Care Ombudsman Office was notified and investigated the home for neglect. Note that the Long-Term Care Ombudsman's Office is responsible for investigating mistreatment in the setting of licensed home hospice care. No further action was taken, and the family was connected with community resources. He was ultimately admitted to the inpatient unit, and his son was always at the bedside and seemed appropriately concerned and attentive.
Thank you for listening in. This is Robin Covington, Coalition Director of the Rhode Island Coalition for Elder Justice. The coalition is a collaborative partnership that includes victim service agencies, senior service organizations, community groups, advocacy organizations, law enforcement, and state departments. Our mission is to develop a coordinated response to elder abuse, address service gaps, improve communication and accountability, and provide workforce training and engage the community to enhance the safety and well-being of older adults. For more information about our work, please visit our website, and thank you so much for tuning in.